Welcome to this video. This is going to be a short video in which we're going to cover the basic definitions of the major eating disorders. So we're going to cover four, and the four are anorexia, bulimia, EDNOS, and then finally a new, quite rare, extremely dangerous and extremely interesting one called diabulimia. So these are, if you like, the ones that are most important and most useful diagnoses. So we'll start with anorexia. A disclaimer firstly. These disorders have multiple different definitions. The definitions that I am going to give you are the common sense, commonly used definitions in general medical practice. They are definitions that are based on medical complications from these disorders, important medical complications, and that is the basis for their definition. They are not, the definitions that I am going to teach you are not the definitions that you will find if you go to a psychiatry textbook, or indeed if you go to the DSM, which is Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, written in America by psychiatrists and psychologists, and which defines all the psychiatric conditions. I am not a great fan of the DSM. It takes a subject that is actually really in real practice quite simple, which is psychiatry, which has really 5 main diagnoses: anxiety, depression, psychosis, mania and dementia. And it takes that subject and turns it into something phenomenally complicated, a huge number of different diagnoses that it has within it. Each one of these 5 major diagnoses that I've just stated is split into a huge number of different subtypes, and it becomes phenomenally complicated, over-complicated in my opinion. So I'm not a great fan of the DSM. However, the DSM does define these disorders, and the definitions that the DSM has is not the definitions that I'm going to give you here, because remember, the DSM is written by psychiatrists and psychologists, and they are interested in defining these disorders based on the thought processes that underpin them, and the behaviours displayed, rather than the medical complications. In general medical practice, we're not so interested in the reason that someone has done this to themselves. Often, there's a plethora of different reasons that people could do any of these eating disorders, and often they're not going to actually tell you the reason in the first place, and if they do tell you a reason, it's often just a lie that they're telling you to appease you, but then keeping the real reason secret to themselves. So in general medical practice, we're not so interested in trying to find the actual thought processes that underlie these disorders, which is what the psychiatrists are incredibly interested in, and what the people who wrote the DSM are incredibly interested in. We're more interested in the medical complications that come from these disorders. So we define these definitions I'm going to give you are based on the medical complications, and we're interested in trying to help them, as much as people with these problems, as much as possible to prevent the medical complications. You'll see what I mean as we go into it, but be aware that I am not going to give you the definitions from the DSM. So, anorexia then. The basic definition of anorexia, and I'm just going to extend my bubble, and I hope you can't see that red line underlying diabulimia. It doesn't like it. It doesn't believe it's a word. So, anorexia then. The definition of anorexia is to have a BMI less than or equal to, I can't find the symbol for less than or equal to on here, so I'm just putting less than 17.5, and I'll just add in there. So this is, BMI less than or equal to 17.5. So that is the basic common sense definition of anorexia, and it's a really nice definition because it means that you can categorically give this diagnosis. Oh, and I should add something onto that actually. There is a other condition, and it's deliberate. If you have a BMI below 17.5 but it wasn't deliberate, then you wouldn't say that that's anorexia. So for instance, teenagers, young teenagers, 14, 15-year-olds who have just gone through a massive growth spurt, particularly teenage boys, when they've just gone through a major growth period, they can end up incredibly thin with very low BMIs, potentially BMIs lower than 17.5, but they might be guzzling a huge amount of food, so it's not deliberate that they're that low BMI, and you would not say that they were anorexic. In addition, people with horrendous terminal illnesses, classically cancer, in the end stages of cancer, the tumour has maybe spread so extensively, it now has a huge metabolic demand. It's guzzling its way through calories, and no matter how many calories that person consumes, it's never enough for the tumour, and therefore they waste away. They lose a huge amount of weight, and they may end up with a BMI less than 17.5. Again, you would not say that that is anorexia. That has another name. It's cachexia. I'll just write that down. So another fancy word here, cachexia, is the name for when someone is wasting away from some horrendous illness, classically cancer, although you can use it for other, well, strictly speaking, its definition is for cancer. However, people use the term cachexia and cachectic to refer to other end-stage diseases where people are wasting away. So things like end-stage HIV, people can waste away with that and would be described as cachectic. So anorexia is BMI less than 17.5 where the person has deliberately made their BMI less than 17.5. And just a reminder of how you actually calculate BMI. So remember the formula for BMI, and it's time for me to actually write with the pen. So BMI is equal to weight in kilograms, and strictly speaking it isn't weight, it's mass, divided by height in meters squared. So this needs to be in meters and this needs to be in kilograms. So if you remember your physics, you will know that weight, strictly speaking, is a force and is measured in newtons, whereas mass is what we usually mean when we say weight. So when people usually say weight, they're actually referring to mass in kilograms. So if we're being strict, we should have it as mass in kilograms over height in meters squared. So just an example, if you weigh 70 kilograms, and let's say you are 6 foot, 6 foot is 1.8 meters, so you'd put in 1.8 here, you'd square 1.8, so you take 70 and you divide it by 1.8 squared. Now, do I dare try and do some maths here? So 1.8 times 1.8, well, 1.8 times 1 is just 1.8. 0.8 times 1.8 is going to be 9/5 times 4/5, which is, why am I doing this, 36 over 5. Started now, I can't, 36 over 25, I can't stop. So 1 and 11 over 25, which is 1.44. So you'd then have 70 divided by 2, 3.24, whatever that is. And it will come out probably at around 20, most likely. So just a demonstration of how to calculate BMI. So it's weight, or strictly speaking mass, in kilograms over your height squared. So that is the common sense definition of what it means to be anorexic, deliberately making your BMI less than 17.5. Now, as I say, that is not the definition that you will find in the DSM. The DSM's definition is far more complex and requires all sorts of thought patterns to underlie it. That's all far, far too complicated. In actual common sense, general clinical practice, if you have a BMI less than 17.5 and you have deliberately made it so, you qualify for a diagnosis of anorexia. And the reason that we make this definition is because having a low BMI, a BMI below this, often causes a whole set of standard medical complications that come with it. And that is what we are interested in general clinical practice. We're interested not in the psychological process that has led you to do this, but in the medical complications that come from having a low BMI. And we'll come on to those medical complications in just a moment. I just want to go through the definitions of I actually just want to go over the definition of bulimia. We'll come on to these other two later on, and then we'll go through once we've gone over the definition of bulimia, we'll then go over the medical complications of anorexia and bulimia, and then we'll come to these later on. So let's carry on. So the basic definition of bulimia, and again, in the DSM, this is much more complicated, but in actual common sense clinical practice, bulimia is when you deliberately induce vomiting. Deliberately induce, and we're going to run out of space. So in fact, I will make it shorter, so we'll put vomiting deliberately. So deliberate. So again, the DSM's definition of bulimia is far more complicated than this, but in actual clinical practice, if you have someone who is deliberately inducing vomiting in themselves to try and lose weight, that is bulimia. Now, people with bulimia don't necessarily have to be anorexic. Some of them may actually be overweight. So remember the different ranges in BMI. So BMI 18.5 to 25 is considered normal. BMI less than 18.5 is considered underweight. BMI less than 17.5, deliberate, is anorexic. BMI between 25 and 30 is overweight. Above 30 is obese. And remember, BMI is not a good assessment in people who are heavily muscular. So in men who are very, very muscular, go to the gym a lot and are incredibly muscular, maybe even use anabolic steroids. These people can be incredibly muscular, huge amounts of muscle tissue, and they can end up with BMIs where they're supposedly obese, potentially, but actually they've got no body fat whatsoever. It's all muscle. So remember, BMI is good for people who don't have a huge amount of muscle mass. If you've got a huge amount of muscle mass, BMI becomes kind of irrelevant. But in the general population who don't go to the gym every single day and don't use anabolic steroids, BMI is a good assessment of body habitus. So bulimia doesn't require you to have any sort of BMI criteria. If you may be obese, and if you are deliberately inducing vomiting, then you have bulimia. You may be anorexic and deliberately inducing vomiting. In that case, you have both anorexia and bulimia. So you can have anorexic bulimia and non-anorexic bulimia. So anorexic bulimia is someone with a BMI less than 17.5 who is deliberately inducing vomiting, and non-anorexic bulimia would be someone with a BMI that is not anorexic, i.e. a BMI above 17.5 who is deliberately inducing vomiting. Now, in the DSM, it has a much more complicated definition of what bulimia is. This is the definition that is used in common clinical practice, and the reason that we have this as the definition is because deliberately inducing vomiting has a number of medical complications that are specific to it. And that's why there is a purpose in actually having this definition. Whenever you define a psychiatric disorder, there has to be a reason that you are defining it. And that reason is usually that it has medical complications, which is why I'm giving you these common sense definitions based on medical complications. So that is the reason that we have this definition of bulimia, because the deliberate induction of vomiting has a whole set of medical complications that are unique to it. For instance, it causes electrolyte derangements. Remember, when you vomit up all your stomach acid, you're losing a huge amount of protons, the acid from the stomach. Your stomach will then have to reproduce that acid, and it will have to take those protons from somewhere, so it will take them from the blood, and therefore you can derange the levels of protons within your blood. You can cause an alkalosis. In addition, the gastric contents has a lot of potassium in it, so you lose a lot of potassium when you vomit. Again, that will have to be replaced from somewhere. It will come out of the bloodstream. So your potassium level in your blood can go down. That's called hypokalemia. Both of those things, alkalosis and hypokalemia, are incredibly dangerous, and they are specific to people who are deliberately inducing vomiting. Hence why there is a purpose in having this definition, and hence why this is the actual useful definition to have in general clinical practice. Just a little bit of information then about the deliberate induction of vomiting. So there are different ways of doing this. One of the main ones is that they stick their fingers down their throat to trigger off the gag reflex. Drinking huge amounts of salty water is another technique, drinking huge amounts of hot water. And then there are drugs that you can take. These used to actually be available over the counter in the UK. I believe in the United States of America, land of the free, they still are available over the counter. So the main one is syrup of Ipecac. It is a substance that is made from the root of a plant, and it contains a bunch of chemically related compounds that are all incredibly emetogenic. They work on the stomach and they make you want to puke, and they usually work incredibly quickly and do make you puke. And these, as I say, this stuff, syrup of Ipecac, used to be available over the counter because it used to be widely used clinically. When someone had taken an overdose, they'd be given this drug to make them vomit it all back up. It's gone completely out of fashion in the UK, but in America, they do still sell this over the counter. So if you go, well, I don't know, I've never been to America, but I am told that you can still buy this over the counter along with AR-15s. In the UK, it's gone. You can't buy it over the counter and you can't use it clinically. It's gone from the BNF. You can't prescribe it, and you can't prescribe any of the isolated compounds. So emetine is one of the isolated compounds from this syrup that has this emetogenic property. There are others as well with more complicated names that I can't remember. Emetine I remember because it's obviously been named because of its properties. But these compounds, interestingly, have other medical uses now. They are actually very powerful anti-protozoal agents, and are used to treat certain protozoal infections. Regardless, back to the subject of eating disorders. So there are multiple different ways of inducing vomiting, either by putting your fingers down your throat, drinking salty water, hot water, and then there are these drugs that you would have to obtain in some illicit fashion if you were in the UK, but which you can buy over the counter in America. We'll have a break here, and in the next video we will discuss the medical complications of anorexia and bulimia, and then we'll go on to discuss EDNOS and diabulimia finally.